An experienced fisherman accidentally stumbled upon a deserted island that was not marked on any map. At first, he thought he would wait out the storm on the shore, but after a few minutes, he realized he had made a big mistake. What he saw among the ruins and traces of a past life made him regret his decision. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. Fernando had lived by the sea for as long as he could remember. The salt seemed stitched into his skin, the call of gulls stitched into his ears, and the slow rocking of waves under his feet was more familiar to him than solid ground. His boat was an old one, a narrow wooden vessel his father had once owned, its planks scarred and faded from years of work, patched and repatched until they bore a history of storms survived and long nights endured. Each nail, each knot in the wood seemed to tell its own story, and Fernando knew them all by heart. Many of the younger fishermen in town looked at his craft with pity, calling it a relic, shaking their heads at his stubborn refusal to modernize. But to Fernando, that boat was not just wood and rope. It was a companion, a last tie to his father, and a vessel that had always carried him home. On that morning, he rose before the first light touched the rooftops of the small coastal town. The port was still half asleep, only a handful of shadows moving among the moored boats, the smell of tar and seaweed drifting heavily in the cool air. Fernando moved with slow, deliberate gestures, hands hardened by years of hauling nets and pulling lines, checking the ropes as though he were touching something sacred. He patched a small tear in his net, his eyes narrowing in concentration, and then he ran his palm across the hull of his boat, the way another man might have touched the shoulder of a loyal friend. From the pocket of his jacket, he pulled out a small seashell, polished smooth by years of rubbing. His late wife had given it to him, telling him it would bring him home safely, no matter what the sea had in mind. He pressed it once between his fingers, murmured a few words no one else could hear, and slipped it back into his pocket before stepping onto the deck. The water stretched out like glass at first, a pale mirror of the sky above, and Fernando felt a quiet calm settle over him as he pushed off from the dock. He had taken this route countless times before, so often that he could have sailed it with his eyes closed. The first hours passed without trouble. The net cast into the water came back light, carrying only a few fish, a small reminder of how hard the trade had become. The sea was not the generous mother it once had been, and many of his companions grumbled about leaving for factory work in the city. Fernando thought about his own son, who had long ago chosen office work far from the smell of salt and fish. He had never blamed the boy, but in moments like these, with the net nearly empty in his lap, he wondered if perhaps his own refusal to change had left him stranded in a life that was fading. Still, he pushed on, steering the boat farther from the coast, chasing the stubborn hope that deeper waters might yield better fortune. The wind shifted slightly, carrying a cool bite, but Fernando thought nothing of it at first. The sea was a living thing, its moods always changing, and an experienced fisherman knew how to read its signs. He looked at the horizon, noticed a thin, dark line forming, but it was distant and seemed harmless. Yet as the hours slipped by, the line thickened, the sky above it swelling with heavy gray clouds that began to march toward him with the steady certainty of an army. He adjusted his sails, frowning as the wind picked up, sharper and less forgiving now. His boat creaked, its old timbers complaining under the strain, and he muttered to it as if it were alive. "Hold fast, old friend," he whispered, tugging at the ropes. By midday, the storm had broken open without mercy. The first lash of rain stung his face like needles, and then the heavens poured all at once, turning the sky into a curtain of water. Waves rose and crashed against the sides of his boat, spilling foam and spray across the deck. Fernando gripped the tiller with all his strength, his muscles burning as he fought to keep the bow pointed into the swell. The sea roared in his ears, drowning out every other thought, every other sound, until he was nothing but a pair of hands clinging to the vessel and lungs fighting for breath. Water seeped into his boots, cold and heavy, and his knuckles split as the ropes tore at his skin. The storm pressed down on him like a living beast, each wave a blow, each gust of wind a threat to his fragile craft. For a moment he thought he saw the face of his father, stern and steady, reminding him of every lesson he had ever learned about surviving at sea. He remembered the first storm he had faced as a boy, trembling but unwilling to show fear, and the rough palm on his shoulder that had steadied him. Those memories gave him strength now, urging him not to let go, not to surrender. Hours blurred together. He could not tell how long he fought, only that time had dissolved into the endless struggle against water and wind. His shoulders ached, his back screamed, but still he clung on. He cursed aloud, shouted at the storm as though it were an enemy, daring it to do its worst. "You won't take me today," he yelled into the roaring black sky, his voice lost but his spirit unbroken. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the storm began to ease. The thunder faded into the distance. The rain thinned to a drizzle, and the waves slowly lost their teeth. The sea grew tired, leaving only a restless chop behind. Fernando sagged against the tiller, chest heaving, clothes plastered to his body, water dripping from his hair into his eyes. His boat was battered but afloat, its old timbers still holding. He laughed once, a bitter, exhausted sound, shaking his head at the cruelty and grace of the ocean. It was then, as the clouds parted slightly and a weak beam of sunlight broke across the waves, that he saw it. At first he thought it was only a shadow on the horizon, a trick of the light, but as his weary eyes focused, the shape grew clearer. Land. A low stretch of coastline, fringed with dark green, rising quietly from the water where he had never expected it to be. He blinked, rubbed the salt from his eyes, but it did not vanish. It was real. His heart lifted, though confusion quickly followed. He had sailed these waters for decades. He knew every inlet, every reef, every rock where nets could snag. There was no land here, no mark on any chart he had studied, no memory of such a place, and yet there it stood before him, steady and undeniable. He felt the pull of curiosity tightening in his chest, mingled with the fatigue of his ordeal. The sea had brought him somewhere new, somewhere hidden, and though his bones longed for rest, a spark in his mind whispered that perhaps this was not misfortune at all, but an invitation. He sat upright, hands firm on the tiller again, and steered toward the unknown shore. The boat groaned under him, but it obeyed. The gulls circled above, crying out as though urging him onward. Fernando's breath came steadier now, though his heart still hammered with the memory of the storm. His eyes never left the silhouette of the island as it drew nearer, its details beginning to take shape through the haze of the rain. He did not know what waited there, but something deep within him insisted that he had to see for himself. And so, with the waves still churning beneath him and the taste of salt sharp on his tongue, Fernando set a course for the place that had risen from nowhere, an island unknown to any map, a secret the sea had chosen to reveal only to him. The island drew closer with every slow push of the waves, and Fernando could not shake the feeling that he was approaching something that should not exist. He had spent decades with his eyes on these waters, memorizing the coastlines and the shoals, the currents that pulled one way in the morning and another at night, the places where the wind always shifted. He knew the sea like a man knew the wrinkles on the back of his own hands. Yet here it was, a strip of land rising out of the gray horizon, solid and undeniable, where he had always believed there was nothing but water. The thought troubled him. Perhaps the storm had thrown him farther than he realized. Perhaps he had been so disoriented by the roaring winds and the black sky that he had drifted into some unknown current. That explanation, though shaky, was the only one he could live with for now. As the shoreline grew clearer, he saw details forming. Dark trees pressed close to the water, their tangled roots biting into the sand. A rocky ridge rose to one side, jagged and bare, while to the other a stretch of pale beach curved gently, like an arm reaching out into the sea. The sight filled him with a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief because he could finally put his feet on dry land after hours of wrestling with the storm. Unease because every instinct in him told him he was stepping into the unfamiliar. There was no smoke in the sky, no sound of voices, no boats anchored offshore, only the endless cry of gulls circling above and the restless hiss of the tide breaking on sand. He guided his battered vessel toward the softer curve of the beach. The boat resisted, its old hull dragging slightly in the swell, but he coaxed it on, careful of rocks hidden beneath the surface. When the keel scraped sand, Fernando exhaled with quiet satisfaction. He lowered the small anchor, testing the rope twice, unwilling to trust even this small task to chance. Then he steadied himself, boots braced against the slick deck, and prepared to climb down. The water was shallow here, no higher than his knees. Still, when he swung one leg over and dropped into the surf, the cold bit sharply into him. He waded slowly toward the shore, his legs heavy in the sucking sand, his jacket clinging to his shoulders with the damp weight of salt and spray. At last his boots struck firmer ground. He climbed above the waterline and stood still, breathing in deeply as his eyes swept over the stretch of sand. The island smelled different from the mainland, richer, almost sweet, with the fragrance of flowering plants carried on the wind from the forest. Yet beneath it was something else, a hint of rot, the sour odor of decaying wood and leaves. He crouched briefly and let a handful of sand run through his fingers. It was fine, pale, untouched by footprints. No one had walked here in a long time, if ever. The gulls screamed overhead, wheeling in chaotic patterns, and their shadows flitted across the ground like restless ghosts. Fernando walked forward slowly, scanning every detail with the practiced eyes of a fisherman who had spent a lifetime reading signs in nature. At first the place seemed wild, raw, and uninhabited. But then he noticed something out of place. Half buried in sand near the edge of the trees was a thick beam of wood, dark with age, its surface scarred by salt and storms. He tugged at it, and it shifted heavily. Looking closer, he saw more of them, driven deep into the ground in a neat line. His chest tightened as recognition dawned. They were the remains of pilings, the bones of an old dock long since broken and swallowed by the sea. He straightened, shading his eyes with one calloused hand, and followed the line of the pilings out into the water. There were more there, stumps jutting above the waves, worn down but still stubbornly standing. So he was not the first to step foot here. Others had been here long ago, long enough to build a dock. That thought sent a chill through him. If people had once used this island, why had they left it behind? He turned from the water and let his eyes follow a faint break in the undergrowth, a thread of flattened earth almost hidden beneath layers of vines and leaves. It might have once been a path. He stepped closer, prodding with his boot, and the ground gave way with the softness of soil long untrodden. The forest loomed ahead, thick and tangled, branches twisting into one another until the light dimmed beneath them. Fernando hesitated at the edge, caught between curiosity and caution. He had no wish to stray too far from his boat, not after what the storm had done, but something in him insisted on taking at least a look. With careful steps, he entered the shade of the trees. The air changed immediately. It was cooler here, damp, heavy with the scent of earth and moss. Insects buzzed unseen, and the distant croak of something hidden echoed faintly. The path was faint but there, leading him deeper among the trunks. He kept one hand near his belt, where his knife rested in a worn sheath. It was small comfort, hardly a match for any real danger, but it steadied his nerves. Not far in, he came across his first real sign of human presence. Half hidden beneath ivy and ferns stood the remains of a wooden structure, a shack or hut perhaps, collapsed long ago. Its roof had caved in, walls leaning drunkenly, but the shape was unmistakable. Fernando stepped closer, brushing away a branch to peer inside. There, under a scatter of leaves, he saw rusted iron hooks, the splintered handle of an oar, and what looked like the broken frame of a chair. The sight pulled at him, filling him with both wonder and dread. Whoever had lived here had left in a hurry or been driven out by forces stronger than themselves. The discovery brought a prickling unease to his skin. This was no untouched wilderness. People had once walked here, lived here, built their lives against the elements. And now nothing remained but ruins swallowed by forest. He thought of the fine sand on the beach, unmarked by human steps, and realized how many years must have passed since anyone had set foot on this shore. He stepped back from the ruined hut and turned slowly, letting his gaze travel through the trees. Everywhere he looked, vines choked what had once been open space. Roots split through foundations, Moss softened what might once have been walls. The island was claiming everything back, burying the past beneath green silence. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, a habit of long years, and whispered under his breath, "Where did you all go?" The question drifted into the air unanswered, swallowed by the rustle of leaves. Fernando returned to the path, his mind restless with questions. He had come seeking shelter after the storm, perhaps a fire to warm his bones, or a bit of food to steady his strength. Instead, he had found the ghost of a place once alive. He felt both drawn deeper and warned away. The forest seemed to breathe around him, not with menace but with the weight of untold stories pressing in from every side. When he emerged back onto the beach, the light had shifted, the clouds pulling apart to let streaks of gold spill across the horizon. His boat waited, rocking gently where it was anchored, and he felt a tug of safety at the sight of it. Yet his eyes kept drifting back to the shadowy trail behind him, to the broken pilings jutting out of the sea, to the shack slumping under its cloak of vines. Something more waited here. He could feel it in his bones. He had come ashore as a weary fisherman searching for rest, but already the island was whispering to him in ways he could not ignore. He sank down onto a dry patch of sand, arms resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the dark line of forest. A man could walk away, he thought. He could get back on his boat, ride the calmer waters, and head home before night. Yet the island stirred something in him that he had not felt in years. Curiosity, a restless itch that told him he was standing on the edge of a story larger than himself. He rubbed the small seashell in his pocket, grounding himself, and sighed. One way or another, he would have to choose. But for now, the sun was sinking, the shadows were growing long, and the silence of the island pressed in close around him. Waiting. Fernando lingered on the beach longer than he had meant to. The exhaustion of the storm and the strangeness of the island had left him sitting there, gazing out at the line of trees, wondering what secrets lay beyond their tangled shadows. The gulls still circled overhead, their cries cutting through the stillness, and every so often he glanced back at his boat, rocking lightly in the shallow water as if reminding him that safety was still within reach. Yet the sight of the old pilings in the sand and the faint path leading into the forest pulled at him like a net slowly tightening around his chest. He had already crossed the boundary once, stepping into the forest far enough to find the crumbled remains of a hut. That discovery had unsettled him, but it had also awakened something else, an urge to know more, to see the traces of the people who had once lived here. The thought returned to him again and again. People had built lives on this island. They had cut wood, hammered nails, tied ropes, lit fires, raised families. He had seen proof of it in the slanted walls and broken tools. But what drove them away? The beach had been silent, empty of footprints, as though no one had walked there for decades. The forest had swallowed the path almost entirely, as if nature itself was eager to erase their presence. The mystery pressed at him, and though part of him whispered to turn back, to climb into his boat and forget this place, he knew he would not. His hands, calloused from decades at sea, flexed restlessly on his knees, and at last he pushed himself to his feet. The tide hissed behind him as he turned toward the trees again. He stepped carefully into the forest, following the faint thread of the old path. The light dimmed quickly as the canopy closed overhead, and the air thickened with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. Insects whined around him, and unseen birds called from high branches, sharp, questioning cries that seemed to mark his intrusion. He moved slowly, scanning the ground, wary of hidden roots that could catch his boots. His knife swung lightly at his side, not so much a weapon as a comfort. Every now and then, he paused to listen, half expecting to hear voices or footsteps. But there was nothing. Only the soft stir of branches and the rhythm of his own breathing. The path twisted deeper, and soon he saw another shape through the trees. At first it looked like a pile of fallen branches, but as he drew closer, the lines resolved into the remnants of another structure. This hut was more intact than the first, though still sagging, its roof caved inward, but some of its walls still upright. The sight made his pulse quicken. He reached out, brushed away a vine, and stepped into the shadow of the ruined dwelling. Inside, the air smelled of mold and old wood. Sunlight filtered in through gaps in the roof, casting narrow beams across the floor. On the ground lay the remnants of a life paused mid-breath. A cracked clay jug rested in the corner, its side split open. Nearby, a short wooden stool had collapsed under the weight of time, its legs scattered across the floor. Against one wall lay a heap of nets, their cords frayed, brittle, and broken. Fernando bent down, lifting a handful of them, and the strands crumbled in his fingers like ash. He let them fall, his heart tightening. Whoever had lived here had been fishermen, like him. Their nets had once carried the same hope of full catches and full stomachs. As he straightened, his eyes caught on something smaller in the dirt. He crouched and brushed away leaves to reveal a simple wooden toy, a figure carved crudely but carefully, its shape vaguely resembling a boat. The edges were smooth, worn by small hands that must have held it day after day. He turned it over, tracing the marks of the carving knife, and for a moment he was no longer in the ruins of an abandoned hut, but in the presence of a family that had once called this place home. He imagined a child running out of the door laughing, toy in hand, while a mother stirred a pot and a father untangled nets by the shore. The vision struck him hard, and he swallowed against the lump rising in his throat. The toy was all that remained of that child's laughter. He set the toy gently back where he had found it, as though disturbing it too much would dishonor the memory. Rising to his feet, he scanned the hut again, searching for any clue to what had happened here. There were no signs of fire, no markings of violence, only the slow, relentless work of time and weather. That unsettled him even more. A place abandoned by force would leave clearer scars, but here, the silence was absolute, the departure invisible, as though people had simply stood up one day and walked away, leaving their lives behind. The thought stayed with him as he stepped outside again. He followed the path farther, eyes alert, and soon he found more evidence. Another hut, its walls collapsed inward. A line of stones that might once have marked a fire pit, blackened faintly by soot though now filled with weeds. A crude bench half swallowed by moss. Everywhere he looked, the forest was reclaiming, bearing the works of human hands beneath roots and vines. Yet enough remained to whisper their story, though never quite loud enough for him to hear it clearly. Fernando paused often, crouching to study objects in the dirt, a rusted cooking pot, a broken sandal sole hardened like stone, the corner of a woven basket. Each discovery added to the puzzle, but none answered the question that now consumed him. Why had they left? The island was rich with trees and soil. The sea was close, offering fish. The air was warm, the rains frequent. It was not paradise, perhaps, but it was no wasteland. He thought of storms like the one he had just endured. Perhaps they had grown too fierce, battering the huts until living here was impossible. Or perhaps the sea itself had betrayed them, growing barren and stingy, offering no food. Whatever the reason, Fernando felt the weight of it pressing into him. He could not help but compare their lives to his own. His village had changed over the years, but it endured. His father and grandfather had weathered hard times, but they had remained on the coast, rebuilding nets, patching boats, stubbornly refusing to leave the sea. These islanders, though, what desperation had driven them to abandon everything? He continued walking until he reached a small clearing where the path seemed to widen. In the center, half collapsed, stood a larger structure. It might once have been a meeting hall, or perhaps the home of the head of their small community. Its roof had caved in almost entirely, but the bones of its frames still stood tall, defiant against the years. He entered slowly, ducking under a leaning beam, and let his eyes adjust to the dim light. There was little left inside but a sense of space, of something that had once been central. He imagined voices filling it, men and women speaking of the sea, deciding when to fish, how to build, whether to stay or go. The silence now seemed heavier, as though those voices still lingered somewhere in the air, waiting for ears to hear them. Fernando lingered there for a long moment, lost in the weight of what had been. Then with a slow exhale, he stepped back into the light. The forest closed around him once more, and he realized the day was sliding toward evening. Shafts of gold pierced the canopy, and the shadows stretched longer on the ground. A tremor of unease ran through him. He had wandered deep into this island of ruins, chasing ghosts that would never answer him, and now he risked losing his way back to the beach. His boat, his one link to home, waited there. He had to return before darkness fell. He retraced his steps carefully, marking each turn, each familiar stump or stone, until at last he saw the pale sand through the trees again. The sight of the beach filled him with relief, though the questions in his mind burned hotter than ever. He stepped out from the forest, the gulls greeting him with shrill cries, and gazed back once more at the dark line of trees. He had expected rest, a moment to recover from the storm. Instead, he had found ruins, fragments of forgotten lives and silence that spoke louder than words. As he settled onto the sand again, fatigue dragging at his bones, Fernando knew one thing for certain. He could not leave yet. Not when the island had shown him so much and left so much unsaid. He had seen the ghosts of the past in toys, tools, and huts, but their story remained unfinished. He felt compelled to know more, to search deeper, to uncover the truth of why this place had been abandoned. And though part of him feared what he might discover, another part, the stubborn, restless part that had carried him through a lifetime on the sea, would not let him turn his back. The sun dipped lower, staining the horizon with fire, and Fernando watched it in silence. Tomorrow he would return to the forest. Tomorrow he would search again, and perhaps the island would speak more clearly. For now he closed his eyes briefly, listening to the hush of waves and the whisper of wind, and felt the presence of those who had once lived here, lingering like shadows at the edge of memory. The past was gone, but its traces remained, and he, against all odds, had stumbled upon them. Fernando slept little that night, though the sea air and exhaustion from the storm pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He had dragged a length of sail from his boat to lie upon, stretching it across the sand where the tide would not reach him, but his eyes kept opening to the sound of the surf and the faint rustle of leaves beyond the tree line. Each time he closed them, he saw the ruined huts again, the broken nets, the child's toy lying forgotten in the dirt. Those images would not leave him, and each time he stirred awake, his gaze returned to the dark edge of the forest, as though the island itself were calling to him. When the first gray light touched the horizon, he pushed himself up, stiff and sore, and walked down to the water's edge to splash salt against his face. The boat rocked quietly where it was anchored, its bow pointed toward the open sea, waiting to carry him home. He stood looking at it for a long moment and then turned away. He could not leave, not yet. Something deeper remained hidden in the island, something that had not yet revealed itself. The ruins he had found spoke of absence, but they had offered no explanation. He needed more than fragments. He needed a voice from the past. So once again he entered the forest. The air was cooler in the morning, the damp ground still clinging to the night's dew, and shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy in narrow beams. He followed the same faint trail as before, moving slowly, retracing his steps until he reached the clearing where the larger structure had stood. There, among the broken beams and slanted walls, he searched more carefully than he had the day before. He moved aside moss, lifted stones, peered into corners where vines and roots twisted together. At first he found nothing new, only the same silent reminders of lives abandoned. But near what had once been a corner post, partly hidden beneath fallen boards, his hand struck something harder than wood. He knelt and pulled at the debris, his fingers straining against the weight until at last he freed a small metal box, its sides rusted, its lid bent and stubborn. The sight of it quickened his breath. Metal was not common here. It meant someone had cherished whatever it held enough to guard it. With effort, he pried it open. The hinges groaned, flakes of rust falling away, and inside, wrapped in a strip of cloth that had long since frayed and blackened with age, lay a book. It was no more than a journal, its cover cracked and softened, its pages yellowed and curled at the edges. Carefully, almost reverently, Fernando lifted it out, brushing dirt from its surface. He sat back on his heels, the forest silent around him, and opened to the first page. The writing was rough but clear, the ink faded but still legible. He read slowly, his lips moving as his eyes traced the words, and as he did, the island began to speak. The journal belonged to a fisherman, a man not unlike himself. The opening entries were plain, describing the arrival of several families who had chosen to live here together. They built huts near the shore, worked together to cut wood, and cast their nets into the surrounding waters. They had come searching for a place of their own, far from crowded ports and the greed of merchants. Fernando's chest tightened as he read those words, recognizing the longing behind them, the same longing that had often stirred in his own heart when he thought of how the sea was no longer as generous as it once had been. The entries grew more detailed. The fisherman wrote of mornings filled with the sound of children's laughter, of women mending clothes, of men hauling in nets heavy with fish. He described evenings around a fire where stories were told, songs sung, and decisions made together. Life had not been easy, but it had been theirs, and they had been proud of what they built. Fernando could almost see it as he read. The huts standing straight, smoke curling from chimneys, people moving about with purpose and hope. But as the pages turned, the tone changed. The fisherman began to write of troubles. Storms grew stronger, more frequent, battering the docks until they were nothing but splinters. One entry described a night of terror when waves crashed over the beach and swept away boats tied to their moorings. Another spoke of hunger, of nets returning nearly empty, of the sea turning stingy and strange. The fisherman wrote of arguments around the fire, of men growing restless, women fearful, and children thinner with each passing season. Fernando turned the pages slowly, his heart heavy. He knew these fears. He had lived them himself, in his own way, on his own coast. He had seen nets return light, had seen storms eat away at docks, had heard the mutters of men who wondered if perhaps the sea no longer loved them. Reading it now, he felt as though he were looking into a mirror held up by time. The later entries grew darker still. The fisherman described the well that once provided fresh water, turning brackish and salty. He wrote of sickness spreading through the camp, of coughing fits that left men weak and children unable to rise from their mats. He wrote of days when the sky itself seemed to close in, when no birds sang, and even the waves were quiet as if the island itself had grown weary. His words trembled with despair, yet still he recorded them, as though holding a pen was the last act of hope he had. The final pages spoke of a decision. The families had argued for days, but at last they agreed. The island could no longer sustain them. With heavy hearts they chose to leave, to seek refuge elsewhere. The fishermen wrote of packing what little they had, of repairing their last boats, of setting their eyes toward distant shores. His final words were simple, yet heavy with loss. We came here to build a life, but the sea has reminded us that nothing belongs to us. Tomorrow we leave, and I pray we find a home that will last. Fernando closed the journal gently, his fingers lingering on the worn cover. He sat in silence, the forest pressing close around him, his heart pounding with the weight of what he had read. Here was the answer he had sought, the voice of the past whispering across time. These people had not vanished by some mystery. They had been forced to surrender to the unrelenting hand of nature. Their lives had been real, their struggles the same as his, their dreams no different from those of any fisherman. And in the end, they had been broken not by war or violence, but by the slow erosion of hope. He held the book against his chest for a moment, his eyes closing. He felt connected to the man who had written it, as though their lives had brushed against one another despite the years between them. He thought of his own town, his own companions who cursed the sea for its dwindling gifts. He thought of his son who had chosen a life away from the waves, away from the nets that bound Fernando to his past. The words in the journal felt like both a warning and a lesson, as though the island itself had placed this record in his hands to remind him of what the sea could take and what it could never give back. As the sun climbed higher, slanting through the trees, Fernando rose slowly to his feet. He tucked the journal carefully into his jacket, feeling its weight against his heart. The island had spoken, and now it was his burden to carry its story. He stepped back onto the faint trail, the forest watching him in silence, and made his way toward the beach. Each step felt heavier, not with fear, but with responsibility. The voices of the past were no longer hidden in the ruins. They were alive in the pages pressed against his chest, and they would not be forgotten. When at last he emerged into the sunlight and saw the sea again, stretching wide and endless, he felt smaller than he ever had before. Yet he also felt a strange clarity. The storm had driven him here by chance, but perhaps chance had been guided by something greater. Perhaps he had been meant to find the story, to carry it back across the waves. He stood for a long while at the edge of the sand, staring at the horizon, torn between the safety of leaving and the pull of staying longer. For though he had found the truth of why the island had been abandoned, he sensed there was still more it had to teach him. Fernando sat on the sand for a long time, the journal resting heavy in his lap, its worn cover warm beneath the sun. The sea stretched out endlessly before him, calm now after the storm, but he could not look at it the same way he once had. Each wave that broke on the shore seemed to echo the words he had read in the fragile pages, the story of the fishermen and the families who had tried to build their lives here. The memory of their hopes, their struggles, their slow defeat lingered in his mind like a tide that would not recede. He ran his fingers gently over the cracked leather, as though touching it might give him more answers than the faded ink already had. But no more words would appear. The rest was for him to piece together, to carry within himself. He opened the journal again, flipping through the pages with greater care now, studying the details he had skimmed before. Amidst the records of storms and hunger, he found something else: practical knowledge. Notes that spoke not only of despair, but of resilience. The fishermen had carefully recorded methods of repairing nets, ways of curing fish to keep them edible for weeks, techniques for smoking and salting that Fernando had never seen written so clearly. There were drawings in the margins, crude but precise, showing knots tied differently from the ones he knew, traps made of branches woven together in clever patterns, tools shaped from stone and bone when metal was scarce. These were not the idle scribbles of a man passing time. They were the distilled experience of a life spent at sea, a lifetime condensed into advice that could outlive him. Fernando's heart beat faster as he read. He recognized some of the methods from stories his father had once told, old techniques long since abandoned when easier ways had been found. Others were entirely new to him, solutions born of necessity, of survival in the face of dwindling resources. He imagined showing these notes to the young men of his village, who grumbled about empty nets and cursed the sea's stinginess. He imagined teaching them to weave traps that could hold fish for days, to smoke meat so it lasted through lean times, to stretch what little the sea gave instead of throwing up their hands in despair. These pages could change lives. Yet with that thought came another, darker one. If he told anyone about the journal, he would have to explain where it came from. He would have to speak of the island, of the ruins, of the families who had once lived here. Word would spread quickly. Curiosity would draw others. Boats would arrive in growing numbers. Men eager to search, to claim, to take. They would strip the island of its wood, hunt its waters, and crush what little remained of the fragile world he had walked through in silence. The toy, the broken nets, the soot-stained fire pit, they would all vanish under greedy hands. The island would not stay a secret for long if he let even a sliver of truth escape his lips. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the journal balanced carefully in his hands. The temptation gnawed at him. To keep the knowledge for himself would feel selfish, almost cruel, when it could ease the suffering of others. But to reveal the island's existence would be worse, a betrayal of the quiet dignity of those who had once called it home. They had left their story behind, not so the world could swarm upon it, but perhaps so someone like him could carry it onward with care. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the stillness, and he looked up at them with weary eyes. He thought of the faces of his fellow fishermen in the village, etched with fatigue and frustration. He thought of their children, running barefoot along the docks, laughing for now but too soon facing the same hunger their parents did. He thought of his son, who had chosen to turn his back on the sea entirely. Was the journal's knowledge enough to keep others from following that path? Could it breathe life back into a trade that was slowly dying? The weight of responsibility pressed into him. He had lived his life by the sea, but he had never held the power to change the course of so many others before. Now with this journal he did, and it frightened him. He opened again to one of the pages filled with drawings of knots, the fisherman's rough sketches of hands pulling rope in unfamiliar ways. Fernando traced the lines with a fingertip, memorizing the pattern. He could learn these, he realized. He could master them and then teach them without ever mentioning the journal. The knowledge could spread quietly, like ripples on water, and no one would ever know from where it had come. That thought soothed him, yet still the temptation stirred. If he showed the journal itself, if he shared the written proof of what he had discovered, men would be forced to believe him. They would marvel at it, perhaps honor him for finding it. And deep inside, though he hated to admit it, a small part of him longed for that recognition. That moment when others would look at him not as the stubborn old man clinging to a battered boat, but as someone who had brought them salvation. The sea shifted before him, the waves pushing a little higher on the sand, as if warning him. He sighed and pressed the journal against his chest, closing his eyes. The island had trusted him with this discovery, and he would not betray it. He would take the knowledge, yes, but not the secret. The secret must remain. Still, the questions would not leave him. Why had he been the one to find this place? Why had the storm pushed him here, and not somewhere else? Was it only chance, or was there meaning hidden in the currents of fate? He shook his head at himself. Such thoughts were dangerous, he knew. The sea gave no reasons. It simply was. Yet he could not help but feel that he had been chosen, though by what or whom he could not say. He rose to his feet, brushing sand from his trousers, and tucked the journal securely into the folds of his jacket. Its weight against his side reminded him of both the gift and the burden it carried. He looked once more at the line of forest, at the broken pilings jutting from the shallows, and whispered a promise under his breath. No one else would know. He would guard the island's memory, even as he shared its lessons. The sun had climbed higher now, glaring off the water, and the heat pressed down on him. He walked toward his boat, pausing to rest his hand on its weathered rail. The thought of leaving tugged at him, but he knew he could not yet. Not until he had learned every scrap of knowledge the journal had to offer. He would study it carefully, here on the island, away from prying eyes until he could carry it all within himself. Only then would he return home, ready to pass it on in fragments, disguised as his own wisdom, never revealing the true source. As he lowered himself into the boat's hull, he rested there a moment, staring out at the horizon. The sea looked calm, but he knew better than to trust its face. He had seen it in fury, and he had seen it in silence. It was like the island itself, full of beauty, full of danger, full of secrets that men could never fully claim. He touched the journal again, feeling the ridges of its cover beneath his fingers, and breathed deeply. He had chosen his path, but even as he sat there, the temptation lingered, like a shadow at the back of his mind, whispering of what could be if he let the secret slip. He pushed it aside, knowing that temptation would never fully vanish. It was his burden to carry, just as surely as the journal itself. The waves lapped gently against the boat, steady and rhythmic, like a reminder of time passing. Fernando leaned back, closing his eyes against the sun, and let the sound fill him. The island had given him knowledge, and with it came temptation. It would be up to him to resist, to honor the silence of the place while keeping alive the wisdom it had entrusted to him. And though the struggle already weighed heavy in his chest, he knew he would bear it as long as he lived. Fernando awoke with the journal pressed against his chest, the leather cover damp with the night air, as though he had clutched it even in his sleep. His body was stiff from resting on the hard sand, and his back ached with the familiar throb of age. But his mind was sharp, clearer than it had been in years. The day before had given him answers, though not in the way he had expected. The words of the long-gone fisherman had poured into him like the tide, filling empty spaces he had not realized existed, and now he carried them within him like a second heartbeat. Yet the weight of that knowledge had grown heavier, not lighter, through the night. He had turned in his mind again and again the choice he had made, to keep the island's secret while sharing the lessons hidden in the journal. It was the right choice, he believed, but right choices often brought no peace. The sea was calm that morning, the waves rolling softly against the shore. and for the first time in days the sky was clear, a pale blue dome washed clean by the storm. Fernando rose slowly, brushing sand from his clothes, and turned his gaze to his boat. It waited patiently where he had anchored it, rocking gently in the shallow water, its hull scratched but sturdy, its mast leaning slightly from the strain it had endured. The sight stirred something in him, a pull both familiar and insistent. It was time to go. He had lingered long enough, had taken what the island offered, and now the world he had left behind was calling him back. The faces of the fishermen in his village, the voices of children along the dock, the smell of smoke rising from chimneys, all of it returned to him in a rush. He missed it more than he had allowed himself to admit. Yet leaving was not as simple as walking back to his boat. He stood at the edge of the beach for a long while, his eyes drifting from the sea to the line of trees. The forest loomed there, silent but alive, holding the ruins, the toy, the broken nets, and the voice of the fisherman whose words had changed him. It felt almost like betrayal to turn his back on it. He lifted the journal once more, weighing it in his hands, and bowed his head. "I'll carry you with me," he whispered softly, not knowing if he spoke to the writer, to the island itself, or to something deeper. Then with a steady breath, he stepped into the water and climbed into his boat. The work of preparing to leave steadied him. He pulled the anchor from the sand, coiled the ropes, checked the knots, and examined the sail for tiers. His hands moved with the instinct of long practice, though each motion was slower now, more careful. The boat felt different beneath him, as though it too carried the memory of the island and the storm that had led them here. When at last the sail caught the morning wind, the boat began to glide away from the shore, and Fernando turned for one final look. The beach stretched pale and quiet, the pilings jutting from the water like broken teeth, the forest dark and impenetrable beyond. He raised a hand, though no one was there to see, and let the island fade slowly into the distance. The sea opened before him, endless and glittering. The wind was steady but not harsh, and for a while Fernando allowed himself to sink into the rhythm of sailing, the creak of the mast, the slap of waves against the hull, the tug of the tiller beneath his hand. It felt good to move again, to be carried forward, though the ache in his shoulders and the sting of salt in his eyes reminded him of how much the storm had taken from him. He sipped sparingly from his flask, the water warm but welcome, and ate a piece of dried fish he had kept from before. Each simple act grounded him in the present, yet the journal at his side was never far from his thoughts. As the hours passed, he found himself speaking aloud, as though the fisherman whose words he had read could still hear him. He spoke of his own life, of the small village where he had been born and where he would one day die. He spoke of his wife, now gone, who had once watched from the shore as he set sail each morning. He spoke of his son, who had chosen a different path, one without nets or storms or salt-stained hands. "I cannot blame him," Fernando said to the empty sea. "But sometimes I wish he understood what it means to live like this. To know the sea, to fear it, to love it, all at once." The words disappeared into the wind, but speaking them eased him. By afternoon, the coastline began to take shape on the horizon, faint at first, then clearer as the sun dipped lower. Fernando's heart lifted at the sight, though a knot of unease twisted in his stomach. What would he say when he returned? The fishermen would ask why he had been gone so long, where the storm had carried him, what he had seen. They would laugh, perhaps, at the old man who wandered off course, or they would press him for tales of strange discoveries. He could not tell them the truth. He had promised, even if the promise had been spoken only to himself in the silence of the island. He would have to craft another story, one simple enough to believe, one that would satisfy their curiosity without betraying his secret. The boat carried him steadily toward the shore, and memories surged with every wave. He thought of the day he first went to sea as a boy, his father's hand heavy on his shoulder. He thought of the first time he returned with nets full to bursting, pride swelling in his chest. He thought of the many storms endured, the lean seasons, the laughter shared with other men at the docks. This was his life, his identity, as much a part of him as the scar on his hand or the lines on his face. And yet, after the island, it all seemed somehow changed, as though he were returning not as the man who had left, but as someone altered, carrying within him a story no one else would ever know. When he finally reached the harbor, the familiar sounds met him. The groan of wood against wood as boats rocked against the piers, the call of gulls fighting over scraps, the voices of fishermen shouting greetings or curses as they hauled in their catches. The air smelled of salt and tar and smoke, and for a moment Fernando simply breathed it in, letting it fill him with both comfort and melancholy. As he tied his boat to the dock, men turned to look, surprise flashing across their faces. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Raoul, called out, "We thought you were lost, old friend. Where have you been hiding?" Others gathered quickly, their curiosity sharp, their voices overlapping in a chorus of questions. Fernando forced a weary smile, shaking his head as he stepped onto the dock. "The storm took me farther than I meant to go," he said simply. "I fought it as best I could, but the sea has her own mind. I spent days finding my way back." The men laughed, some clapping him on the shoulder, others shaking their heads. "You're too old to be chasing the sea so far," one of them teased, though the words were softened with relief. None of them pressed too deeply. Fishermen respected the sea's mysteries, and if Fernando said little, it was enough. That evening he walked through the narrow streets of the village, past houses built of stone and wood, past children running and dogs barking, past women hanging laundry in the fading light. He greeted them quietly, his smile polite, but inside he felt distant, as though he were still half on the island, still listening to the whispers of the forest. When he reached his home, a small house near the edge of the harbor, he set the journal carefully on the table and lit a lamp. The glow flickered across the worn cover, and he sat staring at it, his hands folded before him. He could not show it to anyone. That much was clear. But he could study it, memorize it, carry it into his own life and into the lives of others without revealing its origin. Slowly he opened it again, tracing the fisherman's handwriting with his eyes, absorbing each detail. He practiced the knots in his mind, rehearsed the methods of preserving fish, imagined the traps he could build. He would teach them in time, piece by piece, claiming them as knowledge he had learned through long years at sea. No one would question him. He was old, and the old were expected to have wisdom. The fishermen would listen, and their lives would grow easier, though they would never know whom they truly had to thank. As the night deepened, Fernando leaned back in his chair. The journal closed once more. Outside, the sea whispered against the shore, steady and eternal. He thought of the island, of the ruins, of the fisherman whose voice had crossed time to reach him. He thought of the promise he had made, to guard the secret even as he shared the lessons. And though his heart still ached with the weight of temptation, he felt a quiet resolve settling over him. He had returned home, but part of him would never leave that hidden shore. The sea had carried him there for a reason, and now it was his task to honor it. When he finally rose to blow out the lamp, the pendant of seashell his wife had once given him swung lightly against his chest, and the journal lay waiting in the dark, a silent reminder of the burden and the gift he now carried. He went to sleep with the sound of waves in his ears, the same sound he had known all his life, but now each ripple seemed to speak of secrets, of choices, of futures yet unwritten. Tomorrow would come, and with it the work of passing on what he had learned. But for tonight, he rested in the knowledge that he had returned, alive and whole, bearing the weight of an island that would never again be seen by other eyes. The days after his return slipped into rhythm that was at once familiar and strangely new. Fernando rose before dawn as he always had, walked the quiet streets to the harbor, and pushed his battered boat out onto the water. The motions were unchanged, the rituals of his life carved deep into muscle and memory, but beneath them all ran a current of difference. Each time he tied a knot in a rope, each time he examined the weave of his nets, he thought of the drawings in the journal. Each time he salted a fish, he remembered the careful notes that showed how to preserve it longer, how to use less and make it last more. And each time he stood on the shore with the other men, listening to their complaints about dwindling catches, he felt the temptation burn in him to open his mouth and reveal the secret he carried. Yet he never did. Instead, he began to pass on the knowledge in smaller ways. When one of the younger fishermen struggled with a torn net, Fernando showed him a different stitch, one the man had never seen before. "Just something I picked up long ago," Fernando said casually, and the young man accepted it without question. When another cursed his catch, spoiling in the heat, Fernando suggested a new way of drying and smoking it, giving no hint of where he had learned it. Slowly, quietly, he fed the wisdom of the island into the veins of his village. Never too much at once, never enough to draw suspicion. The men were grateful, their burdens lightened in small but meaningful ways, and Fernando watched as their eyes turned toward him with a respect he had not seen in years. At night he returned to his home, lit his lamp, and studied the journal again. He traced each page until he could see the words even with his eyes closed. He practiced the knots with scraps of rope, his hands moving until they remembered on their own. He whispered the recipes for brine and smoke as though reciting prayers. The journal became not just a record, but a companion, the voice of another fisherman speaking across the years. Sometimes when the house was very quiet, Fernando imagined he heard the man's voice in the creak of the rafters, in the rustle of the pages, reminding him that he was now part of a chain, the keeper of something larger than himself. But with the gift came the weight. Each time he walked along the docks, he worried that his eyes might betray him, that someone might see the shadow of the island in his gaze. Each time a fellow fisherman clapped him on the shoulder and thanked him for his advice, he felt the sting of guilt. The secret pressed against him like the journal itself pressed against his ribs when he carried it tucked inside his jacket. Some nights he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, asking silently whether he had chosen rightly. Could he have told the truth? Could he have shown the others the journal without destroying the memory of the people who had left it behind? He never found an answer. Only the steady silence of the sea drifting through his window. Over time, the village began to change. The new methods Fernando shared bore fruit. Catches were preserved longer, waste was lessened, and the men learned to adapt with a patience they had forgotten. Even in lean weeks, there was enough to go around. The laughter of children along the docks grew louder, freer, and the women's eyes softened with relief. The villagers spoke often of Fernando, of his cleverness, of the strange wisdom he seemed to hold. He brushed it away with modest words, but inside he carried both pride and sorrow. Pride because he knew the islanders' knowledge lived on through him. Sorrow because he knew the true source could never be revealed, not without undoing the balance he had so carefully built. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the water gold, Fernando sat on the shore with the journal open across his knees. He turned the pages slowly, though by now he could have recited every line by heart. He thought of the fishermen who had written it, of the families who had lived and loved and fought against the sea's cruelty. He thought of the final entry, the words that spoke of leaving, of abandoning a dream. "We came here to build a life, but the sea has reminded us that nothing belongs to us." The sentence echoed in his mind, over and over, until tears welled in his eyes. Nothing belongs to us. The truth of it was as sharp as the taste of salt on his lips. His own life, his own memories, even his son's path. They were all temporary, fragile as sandcastles, waiting for the tide. Yet what endured was the passing on of knowledge, the invisible thread that tied one generation to the next. That was the legacy he carried now. As weeks turned into months, Fernando became known not just as the old fisherman who still dared to face the sea, but as a mentor. Young men sought him out, asking questions, listening with respect to his quiet words. He never lectured, never claimed authority, but simply shared pieces of what he knew, letting them fit the lessons into their own lives. When he saw them tie a knot he had taught, or smoke a fish with a method he had described, his heart swelled. The island lived on in these small acts, unseen but present, carried into the future through hands that had never touched its sand. Yet still, late at night, when the village slept and the waves whispered outside his door, Fernando felt the secret pulse inside him, like a second heartbeat. He knew he could not carry it forever. One day he would be gone, as the islanders had been, and the journal would remain. He thought often of what to do with it. Burn it, so no one could trace its origin. Hide it, so it might one day be discovered by another as he had discovered it. Or pass it quietly to someone he trusted, someone who would honor its story as he had. He had no answer, only the knowledge that the decision would come, and that it would be the last test the island set before him. On a clear morning, as gulls wheeled above and the sea glittered like glass, Fernando walked to the harbor with the journal hidden inside his jacket. The young fisherman greeted him with smiles, eager to hear his thoughts on the day's catch. He spoke with them, offered advice, watched them sail out with the sun at their backs. Then he turned and looked toward the horizon, toward the invisible line where the sea met the sky. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the island, quiet and hidden, its ruins crumbling slowly back into the earth, its story preserved only in the worn pages pressed against his chest. He touched the journal gently, feeling its presence, and whispered a silent vow. He would keep its secret to his last breath. Years later, long after his hair had turned white and his steps had slowed, the village still spoke of Fernando. They remembered his patience, his quiet wisdom, the way he had always seemed to know more than he said. They remembered the small changes that had made their lives easier, the knots, the traps, the ways of preserving the sea's gifts. They remembered his laughter, rare but warm, and his silences, which always seemed filled with thought. When he was gone, they honored him as a man who had given much, though they never knew the true depth of the legacy he carried. Only the journal remained, tucked away where he had left it, waiting in silence for another set of hands. And so the story of the island lived on, not in maps or in tales told loudly in taverns, but in the quiet acts of fishermen mending their nets, in the smoke curling from drying racks, in the laughter of children fed by the sea. The secret was safe, but its wisdom endured, carried forward in ways no one could trace. Fernando had become its guardian, its bridge to the world beyond, and though he was gone, the island remained alive in every life touched by what he had shared. On calm evenings when the sea glowed with the light of the setting sun, some swore they could see him still, sitting at the edge of the harbor with a small journal in his lap, gazing out toward the horizon where the hidden island lay. Whether it was memory, imagination, or something deeper, none could say. But all agreed that the old fisherman had carried something greater than himself, something the sea had given him and he had given in turn to them. And the waves went on breaking, steady and eternal, carrying secrets across their vastness, as they always had and always would. If this story kept you hooked, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss the next adventure. Click here to watch our next video. It's even more unbelievable than this one. And don't keep this to yourself, share this video with friends and family so they can experience the journey too.